Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Ladan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Patrick Ganzer. And Ganzer, that's, I guess, a German name, but he's not German, but I just like saying it like that. Anyways, he is a PI at Battelle. And if you heard Dave Friedenberg's episode long time ago, Battelle is kind of a research institute. So it's in the middle between a university and a for-profit company. It's a not-for-profit research institute. It kind of bridges this more basic science with the business side of things. And they reach out because they've published a paper in Cell and basically an update on Ian Burkhart's sensory perception and what they were able to do with that. If you remember from Ian Burkhart's episode a few years ago, he is a quadriplegic. He was injured in 2010 in a diving accident in North Carolina, unable to move his arms, legs, or fingers. And the team, which includes the people at Battelle, were able to give him kind of motor movement back in his own arms. So with his own arms, they were able to bypass the spinal cord injury, and he was able even to do things like pick stuff up, pick up pencils, and even play Guitar Hero. So really cool stuff. So this is kind of an update on that and how they were able to basically hack this system and to not only be able to send motor signals, but also to be able to receive sensory signals with that same implant that he had. And then we also talked a little bit about his work with bioelectronic medicine, which is also very interesting. Okay, so Patrick Ganzer, as you would say in German. A pleasure to have you on the show. You're a PI, like a principal investigator at Battelle, right?
So there's two main programs that I'm PI of, which we could jump into. One is related to bioelectronic medicine, so stimulating peripheral nerves to treat disease. And the other is related to creating neural interfaces that might not require surgery, but you could still get a lot of information in and out to interact with the nervous system.
Yeah, very cool. But so yeah, we'll get to the bioelectronic medicine side of things. Actually, this is kind of more of an interest for me. But the real reason we're talking now is because you recently published a paper in Cell, basically updating what's going on with Ian Burkhart and the closed feedback loop system with being able to move his paralyzed hand. I mean, we've had Ian on, we've had Bolo Ajiboye. I guess we've kind of followed the progression of this. What's kind of the update nowadays?
Yeah, really one main idea. As you and your audience probably already know, Ian has a intracortical chip implanted in his primary motor cortex. The original intention for doing this was quite a grand challenge to have Ian think of movement and restore movement to his paralyzed hand. Since Ian uses his hand to manipulate objects, to pick things up, swipe a credit card, there may be, at least in the initial parts of the study, there was an inkling that there still might be signal coming from his hand while he's touching things. And so, in short, the main discovery that led to a ton of new improvement in Ian, restoring his sense of touch, was that there's actually very tiny residual touch signals that would go through his severe spinal cord injury and still make it up to the recording chip. So we leveraged this in a bunch of different ways to give him touch feedback artificially, to modulate grip pressure. And so that's the general overture of the Cell paper, and we can dive into the innards of the findings here.
Yeah, I think we should do that. You guys had implanted into the motor cortex, and it was only one Utah electrode array, basically 96 probes going in. But are you saying like this was also partially innervated by the sensory cortex as well? And was that always like that? How did that work? Do you guys know?
That's a great question. It would be very nice to have had longitudinal data with regards to where touch and movement are both processed in Ian. The earliest that we did this respective to today was probably 3 years ago, where we started getting sensory information. The idea of cortical maps on the surface of the brain is very interesting, very well explored, right? Where is information mainly processed? It's likely that After injury and with intense practice, there could have been plasticity in Ian's cortex, such that touch and movement representations may have started to overlap. Maybe it was there the whole time. The original intent of the chip implantation was only to target areas that were active when Ian thought of movement. So it would be great to go back in time and get baseline data with regards to where touch is, but we are tracking that now from the point at which we discovered that touch signal is there with movement in the same chip.
So you said that the signals were weaker. Did you guys have to obviously turn up the gain? And was it as accurate as if it had been implanted in the sensory cortex?
Yeah, so to back up and look at the problems that still remain, unfortunately, with Ian, he can perform many different grips with the system. He can play Guitar Hero, he can swipe a credit card. However, the vast majority of his hand is completely insensate. He has a little bit of remaining sensation on about half of his thumb, but nonetheless, he's operating this system, moving with largely no sensory feedback, right? And so we all can imagine or have maybe inadvertently experienced situations where we have very small or interrupted touch functionality, right? If we're shoveling snow outside and our fingertips become numb if we're outside too long, if our limb falls asleep. So this is a massive problem and unfortunately negatively impacts Ian's function until we discovered this and started implementing sensory feedback. The second point is Ian has a very severe spinal cord injury. It's generally referred to as clinically complete or Asia grade A. This generally means that below a certain level in the spinal cord, Ian is unable to either elicit movement that's meaningful around a joint, or he's unable to perceive touch. However, very importantly, just because he has a clinically complete injury, this doesn't necessarily equate to an anatomically complete injury. So there could be still spare fibers left. And to answer your question about the weakness of the signal, even though he has the severe injury, we still can get a faint signal in motor cortex, which hints at the fact that even a small amount of fibers can still mediate reasonable transmission of, in this case, sensory information. And a third point I'll make related to your question is from a machine learning perspective, as long as you have sufficient information content, the amplitude can matter, like if it's really weak one day or really strong another. However, the uniqueness of touch related to movement, and we could talk about how we separated those signals, is still present. So even though it's a faint signal, it's a unique signal, which we demonstrate in the cell paper and decoding it even live.
So it's separate from the noise and it's louder than the background noise, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So I guess those are two different concepts, like basically that not the whole spinal cord is severed. Like there is some percentage of fibers that are still going through. And then with the fact that the motor cortex and sensory cortex, I mean, they're in different spots. So how do those two things link?
Right, so the severity of the injury and specifically the type of injury that Ian has with regards to sensation is what's known as sensory discomplete. And so this is, again, a very severe injury, but there's still some remaining fibers left. And you mentioned that somatosensory cortex is very close to motor cortex. And so with practice, it is likely that some of the representation of sensory information in Ian's brain may have shifted. The chip is basically right next to somatosensory cortex, it's just behind it. And so even though it's a weak signal, there's a lot that can be picked up in a seemingly small area of the brain with regard to mood, muscle stretch, movement, touch. There's lots of reports of vision even being processed in some correlative way in motor cortex. So we could think of the brain as a modular system where certain parts might only do one or two things. But after injury and practice, things can shift around and a certain area can start to multitask. And so it's definitely exciting from a BCI perspective that we can maybe get multiple types of information from a seemingly small area in the brain. And yeah, how this actually occurred, even though it's weak, remains to be studied in other patients. But task practice definitely can play a role in that plasticity, even with weak remaining signals.
Okay. So I think I realize what may have been my issue. He's able to have the sensation with his own fingers. It's not through a device or something like this, because he was wearing a sleeve in order to stimulate the muscles. This actual sensory fibers that are sending that back, right?
Yeah, we can now jump to so without this new system that restores a sense of touch, we've generally discussed how these weak signals get to the cortex, right? And we can record them. Even though the signals are present, Ian cannot perceive these touch events. So if we blindfold him and he's on random trials is gripping a given object, he's with very small objects, he's either completely unable to detect the touch during different grip trials. With larger objects, he's basically guessing at chance. So even though there's a small amount of brain activity related to residual touch that gets to his brain, it's not enough for him to generally perceive it, if at all or consistently. And so, what we do to restore that, since it is a major problem for his general upper limb function, when we detect this residual touch, which is below conscious perception, we then activate artificial haptic feedback on skin that he can feel so that he can then have some conscious perception of these very weak subperceptual hand touch events. If we were to build from where's the signal coming from, how did it get there, to how can we use it to improve it in a BCI application, that's how we restore his sense of touch. So it's these faint signals are too weak for him to perceive unless we're using this closed loop sensory feedback system.
Okay, very cool. And I mean, you're probably sending these signals to a place in the body that's not as innervated. Again, like the lips and hands are very sensitive, and you can manipulate them a lot. And you feel minute differences between those areas. So, because you're putting it on a less sensitive, you're transferring that force or whatever to a less sensitive area. What's the resolution of his sensitivity?
Right. So when we detect these subperceptual hand touch events, we give him artificial vibrotactile feedback on skin that he can feel, specifically around his bicep. So this is on the same side of his paretic hand where we're interfacing with. And we kept the feedback initially simple. So it's was for most of the experiments just an on and off artificial event that triggers or is related to subperceptual hand touch. He was able to learn it pretty fast. It did take some practice, right? So if you're getting a buzz on your bicep and that's not necessarily what you normally think of as hand touch, it's a different location. It still is haptic, right? It's still touch related. The haptic feedback has different options too that we did start working on. Uh, Vibrotactile or vibration intensity, as it would correlate to grip pressure. This is one other attribute. Another would be having different motors on the bicep become active when small residual touch occurs on different fingers. There are trade offs, though. So if we look at haptic feedback from the way that we implement it, it was simply on off. And there's not a lot of rules that Ian had to learn. If we start scaling up to different pressures and different vibrotactile locations, right? This is more things to think about during touch and during BCI operations. And this can actually interfere, of course, with the functional improvement. So we kept it simple in the beginning. We have scaled up a little bit, but when you start having so many rules, the fidelity or improvement related to the artificial sensory feedback can start to be diminished, right? Because you have to think of things while you're operating the system.
Okay. He became kind of used to it after a while. So, how long has he had this? And how long did it take for him to get used to it, brain plasticity to take effect? And do you think he might even get better?
Yeah, so with more practice, there's definitely more room to have exotic feedback modes. luckily, there wasn't a lot of training or learning. Like if we're trying to, you know, play a video game, right? And we have to, if your video game controller is vibrating, knowing the rules and the scenarios in which this has to occur related to the game, there wasn't that much that need going into this. So we did keep it simple on purpose. If we start using it in the home, which is another thing that Battelle is working on a lot to get the system miniaturized, maybe even have this haptic feedback integrated into our sleeve technology. There's a lot more that we can do, and that might require more learning. So that's to be determined. We're working on more exotic haptic feedback in the future, but for right now, it's pretty simple.
Okay. And then another thing that was interesting in the article was you guys mentioned something about demultiplexing. What is that?
Right. So we covered the signal as it relates to the severity of the injury, that it still gets to the brain, and what we can do to restore just touch alone. So having subperceptual touch events trigger artificial sensory feedback. However, when you're moving your hand, you're most likely touching things. So the next level of development that we took in the paper was to try and decode these active subperceptual touch events while Ian was thinking of movement. So if you think about information represented in a small area of the brain, thinking of movement could potentially disrupt this signal, right? If it's too strong, as you were kind of insinuating earlier, it could swamp it out. So the demultiplexing component is related to separating touch and movement. So we were still able to have the decoding of subperceptual touch in real time trigger closed loop sensory feedback to restore that, and also have Ian still think of movement and then trigger stimulation of his arm to move his hand. So this all happens rapidly, and the functional improvements that he has with the system is pretty significant. The demultiplexing is at the heart of this. So we're kind of separating out touch and movement that are occurring at the same time to power different devices.
Okay. Very cool stuff. So before we move on to the bioelectronic medicine side of things, is there anything else that you wanted to highlight in the article? And I mean, this is really cool stuff. I mean, this has been a multi-year following Ian's story. And is there going to be more of these kind of papers?
Yeah, so there's potentially other signals encoded in a seemingly small area of the brain. This, as you might know, the Utah array that's implanted in his primary motor cortex is 4 by 4 millimeters. We talked about touch, we talked about movement. Proprioception is somewhat related to touch, so the state of your limb and muscle stretch. That's something that we're looking into and working on. It looks like that might be another class of information that's within Ian's brain recordings while he's moving his hand. Maybe we could use that to further enhance his function. So that's probably the next arena of this. And then a second that we're working on is using more advanced decoding algorithms that can potentially be more robust to disturbances or shifts in brain activity over time. And that might be more easier to use if you think about this in a take home type of embodiment where the algorithms can update themselves. So those are some of the new things that we're working on. And specifically, we're trying to miniaturize the system and get it into the home with Ian and others. So those are kind of the three newer things on the horizon for the Battelle Neurolife group.
Okay. I had heard something like his device FDA approval wasn't extended or something like that, or is that incorrect?
So we are currently working with Ian now, working on miniaturizing the electronics and getting this into the home. I could probably talk about that in more depth in the future, but look out for an update from the group regarding that FDA approval and working on the system, but I can't say too much more than that.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. So the future of his implant and discoveries from that looks promising for the time being, right?
Yes, yeah, it's something we'll be very excited about. Release in maybe a month or two.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay, let's talk about your bioelectronic medicine side of things. I mean, we had met last year, 2019, at the Bioelectronic Medicine Forum held in New York, And so obviously, if you're attending that, then you're interested in the field, and recommend everybody attend that if they're interested, because it's really cool. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience with bioelectronic medicine?
Yeah, so my first experience with this was in Texas during my postdoc. So I was at UT Dallas for about 3 years and worked with Michael Kilgard, Rob Reneker, and Seth Hayes on a type of therapy that is pretty relevant for spinal cord injury. When I had arrived at the lab, it was mainly used for stroke, and essentially it focuses on vagus nerve stimulation in order to help the brain change and grow new connections and enable neuro-plasticity during rehab. So it's like a rehab enhancer, so to speak, using a bioelectronic interface. The main gist or way it's used is good movements during upper limb rehabilitation. In this case, mostly after stroke, is what this has been used for in animals and humans. Good movements are paired with vagus nerve stimulation, and vagus nerve stimulation leads to the release of plasticity promoting neurotransmitters. So, over time, doing this through thousands of movements, you can get pretty considerable brain change and more connections from the brain back to the paralyzed limbs to help movement be further recovered. That was my first taste down in Texas, bioelectronic medicine.
So, yeah, actually, I had talked to Seth Hayes about this. Unfortunately, not on the podcast. Hopefully, we'll have him on the show one day. But basically, it's almost like it puts you in a fight or flight mode. It's almost like when you have a bear in the room, which who hasn't ever had that happen, and then you're kind of at an alert state, and so you learn stuff very quickly. So you just kind of you absorb more information, something like this, right?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of study on the amount of neuromodulator release that's correlated to the magnitude of a surprise or a shock or a fear type of event. You mentioned bear in the room. Hopefully, that doesn't happen to either of us, but that's somewhat of an appropriate example. We're hijacking maybe similar neuromodulatory circuitry that's associated with a surprise but tapping into it bioelectronically. Yeah, there is definitely overlap between surprise and fear and that burst of neuromodulators and this type of bioelectronic medicine using brief bursts of vagus nerve stimulation.
Yeah. How does this work with bioelectronic medicine, basically being able to control the organs using nerve stimulation?
Yeah, so the work in my postdoc and the team at the Texas Biomedical Device Center, they've done fantastic work before I got there, utilizing this in preclinical studies, basically to enhance recovery after stroke. That's now very excitingly in pivotal trial. They're now starting a like safety efficacy phase 1 trial to test this out in people with spinal cord injury. So a different type of disorder, but still relevant for upper limb function restoration. The work at Battelle that I do now still uses vagus nerve stimulation, but we're focused on treating cardiovascular disease, specifically what's known as ischemia, or bouts where the heart unfortunately doesn't have enough oxygen. This can lead to injury of the heart and so forth. So yeah, the vagus nerve can help with rehab. It can help with many, many other diseases. And at Battelle, we're focusing on cardiovascular treatment. Even though it's the same nerve, it's got so many different connections and plays so many roles in so many different organs, as you're mentioning. That's what I've turned our attention to a little bit here at Battelle.
And then your work, is that done with Ian again, with humans, or is it done with animals, or what exactly?
Yeah, so right now it's preclinical work. You can think of the similarities across the rehab enhancing VNS and the work we're doing now at Battelle as still being both closed loop vagus nerve stimulation. We're using some algorithmic controllers as well related to deep learning, and we're excited to start transitioning that out of the preclinical phase to humans, but we're not just there yet. So we don't do any experiments with Ian with this interface, but soon we hope that we can translate this to individuals once we get ideas of the mechanism and so forth. So.
Yeah, convince him to take part in another trial. I want to talk a little bit about Battelle. I mean, Battelle is a not-for-profit research institute, and this is different than a lot of the guests who have, been working at universities. Obviously, that's like a different, I guess, business model or something like this. I mean, you're a PI, so you're essentially like a professor, same kind of role. How's that difference from a university? And yeah, would you recommend it as well?
Yeah, good question. So Battelle is pretty well balanced in terms of academic type activities and industry type activities. So if you followed me around during certain days, I'm writing papers, working on presentations. Other times, we're looking at our ideas as a business. So, how would we protect our idea? How would we develop it into a device? Can we do that with the market that's out there? So, it definitely satisfies my intellectual curiosity. And at the same time, it's really nice to have your ideas filtered through a scope in which you have to translate these into things that get out of the laboratory. So that's probably my most favorite part of Battelle is that balance in that game when we're thinking about science, but not just to make bar graphs and write papers, but science to discover new things and develop new technologies that get made into devices. So I would recommend it. It's definitely, if you're into translational neurotechnology, there's a lot going on here. You could do that in laboratories as well, but it is a unique place. And yeah, I would say it's pretty 50-50 between industry and academic type activities.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had been part of a lab similar to this in Germany. I did like an internship there, Fraunhofer, and it was a very similar business plan or setup. And I thought it was really cool. It's a little bit more like figuring out what needs to be done. And then you have industry for-profit companies that want to make devices and everything like this. And so Fraunhofer and Battelle are kind of that bridge, that intermediary between those two. And I really like that because you kind of get things away from the bench and onto the bedside. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, so we work with a myriad of academic labs, devices that we've talked about, the BCI, the bioelectronic medicine, other neurotechnologies that we're developing related to our sleeve, which has kind of been a spin out from the bioelectronic medicine works, where we can have a wearable functional electrical stimulation device. There's a long list of things that are developing as well. Lots of companies will come to us because our general niche in this domain of Battelle is medical device development. So you'll have the Medtronics and Eli Lilly and other companies coming and knocking on your door. So it's pretty interesting the variety of things that come through, and we do work with academia, different labs all the time. So it's definitely a lot of variety coming in the door. It doesn't get boring.
Yeah. No, I think that's really cool. I think it's a really good balance. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't know of many more institutes that do this. And yeah, I think there should be more of this in the world.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, Patrick, this has been excellent. I've really enjoyed this covering some of the stuff that you're working on, the two thrusts of your, I don't know, your career, your work at Battelle. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to mention?
No, I think we covered the main contingent of activities. I think one of my favorite parts about working at Battelle and just in the last X years is having your ideas maybe potentially be applied to help people has been very exciting. Also, very daunting and challenging. So, working with participants like Ian Burkhart and having the UT Dallas work be translated to clinical trial has really been so rewarding. And I think obviously the future for neural implants and bioelectronic medicines and BCI is really bright. So I can't wait to see where we're at in 5-10 years with the things we talked about and all the other great work that's going on around the world in different groups.
Yeah, and I think you're on the forefront of a lot of this technology that's coming out, both on the neuroprosthetic side and the bioelectronic medicine side. So I think this is one of the key places that this stuff is going to happen over the next 5-10 years. And it's also impressive because, I mean, you started at Battelle in, what was it, 2017? So making a big splash already. That was just blink of an eyelid before ago.
Yeah, the teams that I've been on all the way back from my Drexel days first was learning about electrophysiology and neuroscience all the way to UT Dallas and here at Battelle, they're really multimodal, lots of brilliant people, statisticians, electrical engineers. You need a big team, as you already know, to do device development, to get these things out into the world, look at regulatory regulations, intellectual property. So it's been a blessing, and without some of those people, this would not be possible. So it's fun to work in big, broad teams. It's also challenging to learn to speak other people's languages, like a physicist or mechanical engineer. But I've been very lucky to be on fantastic teams so far, and looking forward to all the great work Battelle's going to do in the future as well.
Yeah, definitely. Collaboration's hard. You got to deal with personalities, but at the same time, it's better than learning it from zero. Might as well utilize somebody else's decades or years of experience. So, yeah. Patrick, this has been excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for your time, Ladan. Have a good day.
Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that. I really liked it. I love the work that Battelle and Case Western do. I think they do really good work. And obviously Ian is a good friend. Met up with him a lot. And so I'm very curious whatever he comes up with and whatever they're able to do to kind of move this field forward. So really enjoyed this. Hopefully there'll be a lot more stuff coming up. Patrick hinted at a few upcoming research thrusts that they might be doing. And so I think this is going to be exciting. I think we might be getting an update, maybe at least once a year from them and be like, okay, this is the newest thing with Ian. Okay, hopefully enjoy this. See ya.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.